Sounds very discriminating, and you know what? It is.
Mm.
It is discriminating. Sometimes we steal from our families because we don't know how to. The vast amount of power that is used is simply getting out of our orbit. It's like 90-some%. This is a person that is simply lost at sea. This is a person that is either burned out. I mean, they're toast. They're already toast. So this is Netflix binges. This is honestly.
Hey everybody, before we jump into today's episode, we'd like to recognize all those who make this podcast possible. The Lead Today show is supported by all the generous donors of the Lead Today community. Thank you so much for investing in shaping leaders through this podcast. And be sure to like and subscribe on whatever platform you are watching or listening today. All right, let's jump into the podcast. Welcome to the Today Counts show. My name is Winston, and I'll be your host today. As always, we have the man, the myth, the legend.
You're actually doing that.
I'm doing it. He told me, he's like, you're not going to do it. I said, I'm going to do it. Stand by my word. Jim Piper is with us. How you doing today, Jim?
I'm doing really well.
I'm excited for
It's been
today.
a good day.
Yeah. Today we have a friend and new to the podcast, a financial advisor, Greyson Hanna. Welcome to the podcast, Greyson.
Thank you, guys. I appreciate y'all.
Glad you're here.
And we're going to be talking about something, pretty, I think, tangible and real for literally anybody that has a pulse. And we're talking about living intentionally, managing our time, not necessarily time management per se, but being intentional with our time and with our life. And before we kind of get into the nitty gritty and Jim always has, just comes with gems and wisdom for us. I want to learn a little bit about what your life currently looks like, Greyson, and maybe how you might even have some questions around this idea of living with intention and living with, being intentional with our time. And so what is your life kind of looking like right now, and maybe some tensions around all that you're doing and how to make it all work?
Yeah. Well, I'll definitely have some questions. That's for sure. But yeah, like you said, I'm a financial advisor. So that's by day, that's my, my job. But by morning and night, I'm a husband to a beautiful wife. Y'all know her, Tess.
Yep.
Been married for over 3 years now.
I can't believe it's been 3 years already.
Yeah. Time's flying for sure. But yeah, been married for about 3 years. And I just recently, last fall, started going back to school. So I'm getting my MBA at UT Austin, and that's an evening program. So balancing work.
Is that a two-year program if you were going full time?
Yeah. Just under 2 years.
Okay.
Yep. So started last fall, and I'll be finishing up next summer.
Okay.
So that's on Mondays and Tuesdays. So fighting traffic to Austin, coming back same day, doing that twice a week. Quite a bit, but time management, learning how to lead myself is something I'm constantly trying to improve on, for sure.
Yeah.
How are you, quote unquote, balancing all of that? Like what are some things that you often run into that you're just like, I wish I could just get better at that?
It's a constant balancing act where I feel like I'm juggling 3 balls, and one of them is constantly falling to the ground and picking that one up, and then another one's falling. So it's something that I'm still in the process of trying to calibrate. And so this conversation today is going to, help move the needle for me to get better at that. But it's something that just, again, having some sort of idea of what my priorities are and having an accountability partner, my wife being a great example of checking in on me. We can always be accountable for ourselves, but having someone that's checking in on you, knowing what you're going through, and telling you where maybe, you can make some changes definitely helps.
And Jim, we were kind of talking about this before the podcast. We're not really talking about time management per se. What are we really talking about?
I think, I always wrestle with that phrase myself, right? So, the best I've been able to come up with so far is living on purpose. What does that mean? And I was thinking about, what we're going to talk about today. Really, what is it that we're talking about? And that's the best I could really come up with, living on purpose. So that's the what, that our lives matter. And coming from a Christian worldview, we definitely believe that our lives matter. We all have 24 hours in the same day.
Do we though?
I think so.
Doesn't always feel like it.
Yeah. Well, you got 2 little ones at home, so your 24 hours might look a little different, than mine. and Greyson is still running ahead of that situation. So, you know, we have different lifestyles maybe, but we still have the same content of minutes in each day and week and what have you, and what we learn to do with those matters a lot. In fact, what we're doing right now is, if you think about this episode, is really about working on our lives, not just in it. There's a lot of things that the three of us could be doing right now besides this, but what we are doing is we are working on our life versus just diving in with that. And by the way, that is what Stephen Covey called Quadrant 2, meaning very important work, but not urgent. Not urgent. And we'll talk about the four quadrants, during the episode, and how they are not just a theory, but how they can inform our calendar, whether it is proactively or whether we are evaluating last week or the month before, the quarter before, which, note to self, a lot of folks don't do. So we don't we don't learn about how to change things in the future because we don't look back. And it's hard to look back because sometimes what we do is our calendar says this week is going to look like this or that, and it didn't go like this or that. So when you do look back, all you can say is, yeah, that didn't happen. But you don't know why. So I didn't really plan on starting this way, but I'll just throw it in since I'm on this run. Is I make sure at the end of every day that the calendar, even though it's now past, reflects what actually happened. That's a humbling process. And you can't do that too many times and have some sense of self-worth without changing the ball game.
That's really good. And to your point of an accountability partner, maybe this is a accountability tool, leveraging your calendar to hold you accountable to what you said you were going to do or wanted to do, and making time. How much time would you practically say that takes you even?
Well, let me answer it in a broad way, Winston, versus, I will tell you, I think I do know exactly how much time that takes because I've been doing it for a long time. But they are the people that are studying what we're talking about, which is really effectiveness. That's and another way, how do we live effective lives, right? The more responsibility we get in life, the common rule is the more time we need to spend in quadrant 2, not the less. It's a little bit counterintuitive. So you think that as you gain more responsibility, you're going to be busier when you should be less busy and living more in quadrant 2. With that said, gosh, I know this sounds bad, but sometimes I can actually tell you 75% of the time I don't have to change it. I look at it and now when I started this routine, a lot of times I wouldn't change it because I'd look at it and be so discouraged. I would just move on because none of that happened. But sometimes that 1 hour meeting went an hour and a half. And so I will go ahead and stretch that little box to say an hour and a half because the phone tells me so. The Zoom tells me so. It tells me how long I was doing that so I can look back and see. And so what does that tell me? Well, it might have been a great meeting, but I might not have stewarded that time as well as I should have. So, you learn about disciplines and whatnot. So, I make adjustments probably a couple times a week, but most of the time, because of what I've learned and because of the proactive way I plan my weeks, I don't have to do too much.
So you've been doing this for decades, and I know me, the way my personality works is if I don't do something exactly right, it really eats at me. So how long did it take for you to become comfortable with being fluid with your approach?
That's good.
That's a great question. Well, that kind of brings up the idea of temperaments too, I think, because when I'm working with, if we just throw out we'll throw out the Myers-Briggs as an example. When I'm working with an artisan, when I'm working with an idealist, when I'm working with a rational, when I'm working with a guardian, those are 4 temperaments, and a guardian's time frame is now. They kind of live in the now, just as an example. An idealist has great plans and ideas and usually blocks well, but often struggles to follow through because they see fork in the roads all over the place and often take them because they're an idealist. So they, and if you can get an artisan to do a calendar, then and I'm a rational, so it does, I have to admit, it does fit my temperament a little bit better. However, as a rational, I'm also an intuitive, which does mean that I can get moody. So I say, will block myself some time. And as I approach that, I'm not in the mood to do that. That's a real thing that happens. So one skill set that I learned is if you do your calendar in a proactive way, you can move blocks around. There might be something else that I want to do and I can move that block around. But the other thing, and your question is fantastic, because in a sense, the calendar informs you, tells you what to do, like an executive assistant when it's running properly, but you're okay with it because you are the one who was upstream further to inform that EA, that process. So it's another form of accountability. However, if you lose your sense of now, you lose your sense of opportunity, you lose your sense of grace, then maybe you've gone too far. Maybe if you feel like a failure because you didn't, work through it, that I would say that's probably be taking it for granted. It's kind of like when people don't accomplish goals. If they don't accomplish goals, it's usually for one or two reasons. One is that their plan is broken. So the good news is you can fix your plan. Or you didn't do what you say you're going to do. And a lot of people drop their head and they say, oh, well, I'm a slouch. I'm lazy. I don't know that that's usually the case. Usually the case is it's probably somebody else's goal.
Mm.
It's not your goal. Because if it's really your goal, because you really want to do it, you will have the desire to do it. So I come from a little bit of a different angle. So I definitely don't use these disciplines, this philosophy to beat people over the head. So it's a great question. I think I'm still learning. I'm still learning about myself and what makes me more effective. And I'll tell you this, and I've shared this in our last few podcasts and sidebars. Winston's been part of that. Because I'm a starter, because I'm a catalyst, that's my nature. So if I was coaching me, one of the things, and hopefully now I can coach myself, but um, I love ideas. I love new projects. Now I've learned to say, okay, let's go ahead and set that aside for a few days and see if if I'm still interested in that a few days later. And a lot of times, a few days later, I don't remember having the idea. So, it's learning about yourself and knowing what to do with these kind of distractions that come in life. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it's really good.
Yeah.
Kind of want to circle back briefly before we jump into a specific tool and approach that you have around this topic. But you mentioned busy, and I think busy for many of us is a badge that we wear, and we've kind of, whether by osmosis of the culture, have learned to kind of put that on. Like, how's your week going? I'm just busy. I'm just busy, right? And then we don't really know how to approach that idea, other than I guess this is just how it goes. The older you get, the busier you get. I've been trying to use the word full, just because busy has a negative connotation.
Because when I ask you that question, you can't say busy to me.
I had a full week.
Because busy to me means you don't know what to tell me. That's what it means to me.
Grace, maybe you can attest to this, and I think maybe I think more so on the younger leader side. Sometimes you almost feel a sense of guilt when you aren't busy, like when you don't have activity, and it's kind of like, what do I even do with Quadrant 2 time? What do I even do if I don't have a meeting, or and it feels like I feel like I need to fill that with something. Have you ever wrestled with that?
Yeah, no, you hit the nail on the head with me. I constantly battle and struggle with that. If I have downtime, these days it's a little bit few and far between to have that, but when I do, I don't know what to fill that time with. And then two, if I want to go do something that I enjoy, I have to justify it to myself. And so that's where I think being proactive and setting aside that time and knowing how I'm going to use that time, it just sets yourself up for, freedom to think big picture, right? That quadrant two thinking. And I know for me, just taking the time because I'm so busy, because I'm guilty of using that term. I don't even know what my quadrant two content is. What's important but not urgent to me.
Mhm.
What are the things I need to be tackling, you know, in the long term, a year from now, 2 years from now, that I can start setting and planting the seeds now and thinking about big picture. So a constant struggle for sure for me.
And I think big picture is a great segue to where you want to go, Jim, which is kind of backing away, not just looking right at
Yeah,
quadrant two, but taking a step back. What does that need to look like even before we start to think about quadrant two?
that's great. That's great. Maybe if we could agree that we're going to try to marry right now the what, which we said is something like living intentionally, living life on purpose, that kind of thing. So that's the what, and the why. But how do we get to the why? I've written some notes to myself just so that I wouldn't forget. And then I do want to describe those four quadrants, Winston, before we, get into the how. About this whatever we want to call it, time management, or whatever. I think the first thing that I want to say, so we're at 30,000 feet in this conversation right now, is that leadership is an inside out proposition. So wait a second, I thought we were talking about time management. Well, leadership involves leading ourselves. And if we don't learn how to lead ourselves well, then how do we expect to lead others well, right? It's kind of like that thing that some people can throw in our face. If we don't manage our own household well, how can we, manage something larger? I hate it when we put it in negative terms. I like putting it in this term. If you can lead well at home, then you can probably lead well anywhere.
That's good.
And I always try to work hard on, okay, what's the positive side of that, platitude, that we often hear. So when I mentioned leadership as an inside out proposition, some of the things that I've talked about in the past, tools that I've created for myself, and there's nothing new under the sun. So I probably learned this from that person, this from that person, and so let's just give credit to everybody who's a learner and a leader, because we learn from each other. But there was a day that I remember I was in a coffee shop and I drew a circle, because if I take this big idea seriously, that leadership is an inside out proposition, and then if I want to be a better parent, then that starts with me. If I want to have a better marriage, oh, that probably starts with me. If I want to have a closer walk with God, then oh, that probably starts with me. You get the idea. So I wrote, I drew a little circle, then I wrote Jim. I put Jim right in the middle. Then I sat back and this didn't happen super fast, but over time I wrote a circle outside of that circle that encompassed that little circle, but provided another space for me to write. And the next most important thing to me in life, I thought about was people, my relationships. And being a speaker my whole life, I already didn't like Jim and then people. So I wrestled with that and I said, okay, I think this is going to be good. I don't know where this is going, but I'm going to share this with somebody someday. So I'm going to change Jim to person. So my personhood, that's where we start, and then people. And then when I drew another circle around that one, I ended up thinking about everything else in life: work, health, sickness, struggle, seasons, going to school, all these kinds of things. And so I wrote the word place. And so, before we can even talk about managing our time, I think it's a good thing to sit back and think about, how am I doing? Who am I? Where am I going? And I give all kinds of questions. So I'll throw them out real quick that I like to do in my coaching, and even coaching now. All right. So you guys interrupt me if I'm going too fast. Questions like this: what do you want to do with the rest of your life? I don't care whether you're 12 years old or you're 85 years old. That's always a good question. I could literally be on my deathbed and still I think that's a good question. What do I want to do with the rest of my life? So the person, people, place, the idea is, if I work on creating a healthier me, healthier person, that's probably going to overflow and influence better relationships. But we don't have time for all this in this episode, but just real quickly, what I mean by that is then I began to realize that I can't have the same kind of relationship with every person that I know. And then I began thinking about Jesus's following, and, and you could break it down into multitudes. You could break it down to the 400. You could break it down to the 40. You could break it down to the 12, and you could break it down to the 3. Now, not that we have to follow that model, but I began to realize, oh, you know what? In order to be effective in my relationships, part of the me work, part of the person work, is I needed to realize that as I start bleeding into the people side, I got to choose my people. Sounds very discriminating. And you know what? It is. It is discriminating. Sometimes we steal from our families because we don't know how to create boundaries in other relationships outside of our family. And then finally, place, just real quickly there, places wherever we find ourselves in life, that might involve work, going to school. Winston, you got 2 little ones at home. And I think what I have found to be very healthy in my life is to identify what season I'm at in life. Because if I can identify what season I'm in life, it helps me think better about, Winston, where I think you're trying to lead us in this conversation. It really is an idea of thinking about life before I just dive into the calendar. And even more than that, what tools do I have to even dive into the calendar? Which, what we'll talk about next is the quadrants.
Yeah, and if I can kind of just circle back to this idea, which I think you're hitting it pretty straight on, but the tension that a lot of us wrestle with is letting our life and the demands of our life form us versus interrupting that cycle and making a decision. I'm going to inform the type of life I'm going to live. And I have to reconcile within myself first, to your point, who am I? What are my values? What are my desires? Where do I want to go? And then from that place, how do I walk that out? How does my calendar reflect that? But if we never make time, or we never take the effort and the thoughtfulness to reconcile and make a decision about who we are, then we will just constantly receive all the different demands, fatherhood, family, work, culture, life, and life is happening to us instead of actually living life, which I think is where you were going initially, is living on purpose.
Yeah, I mean, let's take, for example, Greyson is pursuing a master's of business administration. I think that's what MBA stands for. And I would call that a disrupting activity.
To put it lightly,
yeah. And to choose to be a father like you have is a disrupting choice to do that.
To put it lightly.
To put it lightly. All right. Just making sure we're all on the same page. Business celebrates disruptors because that creates innovation, that expands economy, that pulls from more of God's resources from all of the talented people that he has created. To your point, and what you were getting at is that we can live a life where now we are to respond to things in life, that there are things that happen to us that come out of left field, as we say, that we have to respond to. But the systemic way that I believe that God has made us is to be disruptors. And we have to start by disrupting our own lives. Let me give you an analogy. When a rocket, and we'll talk about this probably if we have time later on in the episode, or we'll have to do part 2. But the way to disruption is the creation of better habits, not just ideas, but habits that you reverse engineer through a planning process, which we haven't used the term yet. But what Jim uses is what's called a playbook, speaking in the third person. But creating new habits is like a rocket that's trying to explode out of our I don't know what the right word is, but I'll just say our gravity.
Orbit.
Yeah, our orbit. And I don't remember the percentages, but you guys might know this at the top of your head. But the vast amount of power that is used is simply getting out of our orbit. It's like 90 some percent of the power of that rocket just to get out of, to disrupt. Then once they get into space, they use very little power. That's a lot what we're talking about, very similar. So I think what we do is we quit too soon because we underestimate what it takes to finish that MBA, what it takes to be a father who is present, realizing that though you got a ton of work to do, being present at that moment with your child is the most important thing you can do. And you are basically disrupting the rest of the chaos in the world. And you're saying, this is what I'm going to do. When I learned about the power of presence, it changed me as a person. That's why I'm even more discriminating about what I say yes to and what I say no to. I try to meet with one person at a time, and I try to take on one task at a time. But the world doesn't like that. The world wants, especially nowadays, with our mobile phones, texting, emails, and what have you. They want me to be responsive right now. And frankly, I want the world to be responsive to me also. And I have very little patience for those that are not responsive. So I get it. But this is a life that God has given me to steward. And if I'm going to serve, I need to understand how I'm going to serve so that I can be better at serving. But it can often be misunderstood, for sure.
You touched on, this idea of a playbook. Walk us through, what that even is. How would one leverage that, whether it's the specific playbook you're talking about or, a general version of one?
Yeah. Can we talk about the quadrants first real quick?
Yeah.
Or at least let me define them. And I gave you guys notes on that. Let's just look at it real quick. So that way, because I think we've thrown the term quadrant 2 around already, and maybe our listeners are already lost. So let me explain. So Stephen Covey, and I don't know if it was actually original with Stephen Covey or if it came before him, but he definitely made it popular. So, and that's in the 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, which even this morning I was listening to on my walk. I think it's one of the most, when it comes to leadership, there's a lot of great books today that are very innovative, very creative thinkers, and man, they're good. But if you're looking for classics, ones that I just don't think are ever going to go away, there's 2 by Peter Drucker. One is called The Effective Executive, and the other one is like Managing the Nonprofit. And you might say, well, why are you throwing Managing a Nonprofit? Well, when I read through that book, there's principles in managing the nonprofit that the for-profit needs to learn that they will be better at if they did. And the nonprofit has a lot to learn about being an executive on the other side. So both of those books by Peter Drucker, and then the 7 Habits of Highly Effective People by Stephen Covey. So anyway, real quickly, so imagine 4 boxes, 4 quadrants. One big box broken up into 4 smaller boxes, right? And the quadrant 1 is entitled Urgent and Important, and the definition of that is crisis, deadlines, and problems. Now, in my ministry and in my work, and the reason why I call them both is because I often tell my clients, I said, I know you view what I do as a business, and I suppose it has business principles, but I view it as a ministry, and that's only because they haven't looked at my playbook. My playbook, my professional playbook, is about shaping leaders. And I don't see that as a business. I see that as a calling. I see that as a ministry in my life. So I do try to over deliver and under promise, as we say. So that's crisis, deadlines, problems. And if you color code it, I think red is a perfect color, for that. The truth is, and I don't mean to be, I mean to be disruptive, not hurtful, when I say most leaders live in quadrant 1. And that is where I'm going to diagnose, I know this hurts, where you're being less effective as you could be. Because when you live in quadrant one long enough, everything that moves seems like you should be taking care of it. In other words, all you know is quadrant one. Quadrant two, the best you can think of is going on vacation to Hawaii, which would be a quadrant two, but you've been living in quadrant one so long that when you get to Hawaii, it takes you 3 days to realize you're in Hawaii. And then you get 2 days of enjoying Hawaii, and then you start thinking about the work that you're falling behind on, and you start cheating and doing your email and your texting and your phone calls. You're living in quadrant one. And you're not as effective as you think you are because, you've taught many of those that are working for you that you solve their problems. You have an I can go on and on. All right.
That's good.
Quadrant two, the title is not urgent, but important. And this is things like planning, relationship building, personal growth stuff. You can throw in things like exercise, resting, whatever. And I always think of Big Blue, IBM. I don't know why, but I think Covey, colored that blue. I don't use blue for my calendar. I use green because green to me means grow. And so if you look at my calendar, anything that's green, whether it's an appointment or a block of time or some activity, that means I am labeling it as quadrant two. So when I take a look forward, the first thing I'm looking for is I don't have to get my magnifying glass out and to do a hard audit. I can see what colors are dominating my calendar. And I do have red and I do have green. Now, the other two colors I trade not to ever have. So let's look at them real quick. Quadrant three is entitled urgent, but not important. So why would those even be in our lives? Right? In other words, there's somebody else's highly important things. So that's interruptions, some emails, and some meetings that you're wondering why you're in that meeting, right? Because you haven't disrupted that issue. And I do like this color, yellow.
Can we hang out there real quick? Because I'm
course.
sure maybe Grayson, you can speak to this. I've experienced and have worked and talked with leaders that have experienced the tension of maybe this is leading up or leading laterally, but you find yourself once again responding to the demands of, hey, be in this meeting, be on this call. Even friendships, we can boil this down to back to relationships. Hey, come hang out with me. Let's go grab coffee. Let's go to this event. And you just find yourself there, and maybe it becomes a rhythm, and you've given people permission to draw you in, but you don't need to be there. What do you do?
You're asking me?
What have you done, Grayson? If you've done anything, what?
Yeah, I'll speak to it. You may not like it, but I'll speak to it.
Grayson, what does that look like for you?
I'm still figuring that out, but something I'm thinking through as we were just kind of talking about this. I feel like yellow is a symptom. If you're in quadrant three, the color code is yellow. It's a symptom of not having enough quadrant two time in your life.
Very good.
You said you color code it green for growth, but I also was thinking of the idea of sustainability, longevity, like you're able to sustain life and sustain multiple seasons. It's kind of like I had the analogy in my head of, I guess maybe it's because I'm driving to Austin a lot, but getting oil changes and tire rotations.
Yeah.
If you're going down 35 twice a week, putting hundreds of miles on your car, going 80 miles an hour, you can't just do that forever without taking your car in and rotating tires, getting oil changes. Your engine's gonna explode, your alignment's gonna be off. And so that quadrant two time, the important stuff that's not urgent, so it's not top of mind, that's going in, getting maintenance done, having a diagnostics run on your life, on your calendar, on your leadership, on your processes. And if you don't do that, then you start seeing things popping up on your calendar as like, why the heck am I having these meetings? Why am I responding to this email at 12:30 in the morning? I mean, I catch myself doing that, and it's boundaries, but it's a symptom of not having that quadrant two.
That's great. Yeah. And then when you guys get my age, you'll notice that there's a lot of softball pitches that are quadrant two. So all my doctor visits, my dentists,
Mm.
you end up going there more the older you get, but they are green. And there's a lot of people who ignore that, so that's quadrant 2, it's a battle, when you get older. You guys hit the gym and I hit the gym, but I'm
Where
spending,
does it hit you?
yeah, it really does. It does hit me for sure. But yeah, if you look at my calendar, my dentist appointments, my doctor's appointments, I'm having to be much more proactive. When I was 25, who needs a doctor? I mean, I'm running hard and yeah, so but that's exactly right. Oil changes. I mean, when you were talking about when you were using the automobile, as you didn't say that, but that's what, my mind went to. I thought I saw my body. I go, yeah, oil changes. We got to replace that shoulder. We got to do this. We got to do that.
But yeah, what would you say to the leader that finds himself stuck in a responsive loop and they maybe organizational savvy to
Yeah.
come out of that?
No, that's really good. In most organizations, I don't find bad guys. I just find systemic habits that aren't the best, systemic. And if I want to get negative, and I don't, but uh, cultures that aren't thoughtful enough. There are, I you know, people get meetinged to death. And Patrick Lencioni in his work, Working Genius, talks about that. He talks about the different types of meetings there are. There's really kind of three main types of meetings, and we try to get too much. Typically, we try to get too much done in a meeting because we're trying to take all three phases of a project in one meeting, and then you got everybody. It just doesn't work, So a lot of times you're still going to have to go to those meetings because your organization is still maturing and understanding those things. But it doesn't mean that you can't ask the questions. You can't, a lot of my coaching with junior leaders is helping them to do exactly that, Winston, is to learn how to become more proactive, ask respectful questions, make respectful suggestions about how we might be able to use our time better. But a lot of that does, go on. I mean, that right there is probably an episode, but I would say you can be more proactive than you think you can be to get yourself out of meetings. That's at least at a certain stage, So for example, in every organization, there's usually big projects, and we get everybody rallied together because it's a big project. If somebody had a little bit more knowledge about what we're talking about, what they'd probably do is invite A, B, and C to that type is leaving me right now, but it's basically the ideation stage, and there are certain people that are just better equipped, for that, and then there's that discerning and implementation stage, and then there's the execution stage. And those really are three different kinds.
Activation maybe is the
Maybe, yeah, activation. There you go. So so those are three different stages, and take somebody who has, if we use Patrick Lencioni's ideas, you take somebody who has tenacity. You are killing them if you are bringing them in those first two phases. You're literally killing them, and you're wasting their time. And once you get around that corner, though, and you start needing people who know how to hold everyone accountable for task 2, get ready to button this project up, then that's where they come in. It's a long way to answer your question, but it is a real thing. And quadrant 4 is the most dangerous of all. If you find yourself in quadrant 4, which is not urgent and not important, which they describe as distractions and time wasters in gray, this is a person that is simply lost at sea. This is a person that is either burned out. They're toast. They're already toast. So this is Netflix binges. This is honestly having one drink too many, 2 drinks too many, doing things, crossing lines, not paying attention to what we're eating anymore, no longer working out, saying what you think, and instead of having some emotional intelligence and holding back, some of your words. When you get to quadrant 4, you've already lost, usually is the situation. But you might be able to look back at seasons in your life, I know I can, and say, man, I was just totally out of control there. And what's really crazy is a lot of time quadrant 4 comes after a big victory. Yeah.
Let your guard down.
Let your guard down, and it sneaks in. It has a way of sneaking in. So these are real. These are really important things, and that's why I don't like to short circuit this in a conversation that we're having, because the how is important, but if all the things that we're talking about, the what and the why, isn't really embraced, you're not going to do the how anyway. But when these strike you, you go, goodness, wow. And then you go, my life is too important for me to be in 3 and 4. And I'm going to be in some ones. And sometimes there is a season, you guys, where maybe 70% of your time is in quadrant 1. There are times when the ship is on fire and, you got to bail water and you got to, save somebody that's dying. There are those seasons.
Burp a baby at midnight.
Burp a baby at midnight. Yeah, I don't see that in my future.
Hey everyone, we're going to take a brief break from the podcast to let you know our very own Jim Piper has released a brand new book called Story, The Art of Learning from Your Past. Everyone has a past, but not everyone learns from it. Jim unpacks lessons in this book that help leaders and learners understand the potential our past has to impact our present and our future. Be sure to grab your copy of Story where books are sold. All right, let's get back to the podcast.
Well, Jim, let me ask you this.
Yeah.
So I imagine getting to quadrant 4 isn't just a flip of a light switch.
No.
It's a gradual transition.
Decline.
So what are some early signs or symptoms that you can spot before you find yourself fully in quadrant 4 or aspects of your life fully in quadrant 4?
Yeah, that's great. There's probably, I'll take a stab at a few that I've seen, but there's probably dozens and dozens, right? So, when you're working in a job that simply doesn't align to your strengths, that's going to burn you out. Again, I'm referring to Patrick Lencioni only because Lencioni, because he comes to mind since we've been exposed to that a lot lately in the communities that I've been involved with, even the workshops that I've led recently. One of the things they talk about is, there's 3 kinds of containers that could possibly hold coffee. You have one that has a hole in the bottom, and that's when we're working out of our frustrations, things that we're just not good at, that don't fulfill us. And so just think about how long that coffee lasts. Doesn't last very, very long. So if somebody is working in that kind of a situation, they're going to, because they don't have a mission in life, they're going to find other things to do, and rarely are they healthy. The second one is like you go to Starbucks, and it's amazing how hot that coffee is, and it does last for, a good period of time, but you can't leave it on the counter and come back 4 hours later and it be hot. It's not. But I don't know about you guys, but I cannot take a cup of coffee from Starbucks and drink it. I got to set it down for 5 minutes. It does. And so those are competencies. But one of the biggest burnout, what research has shown, is that we don't usually burn out of our frustrations, because we usually find ourselves in that and we get out fast. Where we burn ourselves out in is when we develop competencies, and people see our competencies and they keep giving us stuff for our competencies, and we go, okay, and we're receiving love from doing those competencies. And so we stay there, but there's a burnout factor. It's not mission focused. It's not, working that from the inside out, really thinking about where I want to go in life. What do I want to do? So that's where a lot of it comes from. So that's where it sneaks up on you.
Mm-hmm.
It's not the frustrations, it's the competencies.
Yeah.
And then your geniuses, those where you get fulfilled. So normally, you're going to align that to some mission, and you don't usually have to worry about that. I would say another thing is that generally in life, you can't fight 2 battles at the same time. That's why when I work with younger people, I'm looking at that debt thing, and we'll talk about some definitions here about character in a little bit. But when your marriage is going sideways, and so now you have a battle there, and you got a battle at work, there's only so much a person can handle. There's only so many fronts that you can deal with. You have somebody close to you dying of cancer, and you're trying to focus on your work and these other kinds of things. So as a leader, it's important to pay attention to the people in your life, to recognize that they are human, and And, depending upon their temperament, they may tell you, they may not tell you. So everybody's a little different. But I would say generally, if you see a change in somebody's normal behavior, that is a symptom that tells you that they're heading to quadrant 4, 3 and 4. Well, 4. I'm just going to say 4.
It's good. As we've unpacked, the quadrants, you've alluded to this playbook as a response to, or, a tool to help us walk through these quadrants appropriately and view them well, and even have a, plan strategy for them. What is a playbook?
Covey taught me the principles, and I was all in. At the age of 27, I was frothing at the mouth Covey fanatic. I in those days, we didn't have the software programs. The little Apple computer was out. I don't know if you guys remember that one with the little box, little window. I owned one of those, but the everything was still analog. Everything was still, calendars were still written out, with your pencil. And so he created this very elaborate system. And for me, it was exhausting. It taught me that I think that Mr. Covey, who's no longer with us, and I had a similar temperament, but if I were to have a scale of 1 to 10, my anal scale might be at a 7. And I learned that mine was which is pretty high, right? His was probably like a 10 point something. And I realized that he really made, and this is no criticism to him. I think he's one of the most brilliant minds when it comes to this that has ever lived on the planet. I just couldn't keep up with his work. It was like a full-time job, doing it all. So back to Greyson's question, earlier about, how do you learn about yourself and whatever. But if I didn't do that, and for like 3 years, I followed it like a religion. And man, I learned a ton. One thing I did learn is I can't do this. Rockefeller. Rockefeller, if you're not familiar, was probably one of the wealthiest men in America, ran, billion-dollar organizations before billion was a popular term. Now we're talking about trillionaires coming around the corner. Billionaires are almost like a dime a dozen now, like millionaires used to be. Well, anyway, he ran all of his enterprises with a 1-page strategic plan, is what he called it. A 1-page. Now, it's kind of a lie because it was actually front and back. So, all right, call it a 2-page. And I said to myself, if he could run all those enterprises with a 2-page strategic plan, certainly I can run my life with a 1-page. And as time went on, it did become 2 as well. But I created what's called a personal playbook and then a professional playbook. We also created a team playbook, but we're not going to talk about that today. The best way for me to describe a personal playbook, and I learned this trial and error, but the better thing to, if I were to give it a different name, I'd call it my personal constitution. My personal constitution in my mind is a foundation, which creates strength for my professional playbook. And my professional playbook is important to me, but it wouldn't nearly be what it is without my personal playbook. So let's just maybe talk about some concepts on there. So one of the things that I've learned that's different, and a lot of this is going to be semantics. And so, people might get frustrated with this, but if you give me a chance, I can talk through this. And as you guys ask questions and maybe share some of the things you've learned, it'll help. So let me just barf out all of the components of one first, right? So there's vision, but I'm going to share things with you guys though that's probably different than what you've picked up on the streets, right, in school and whatever. But just remember, I've been there. I've been on that road. So I'm not poo-pooing anything. I'm just telling you what I've learned and what I share with my clients. So there's visions, there's values, there's purpose, and there's goals, goal steps. Goal categories, goal statements, goal steps. There are habits that are daily, weekly, monthly, quarterly, semi-annually, annually, and then there are character elements. I know that sounds, oh my gosh, okay, I'm out, right? That's a lot of stuff. But it's a process, and it's a very important process. Now let me go to the end. let me talk about the equation, and then let's go ahead and talk about whatever you guys want to talk about from there. So I put together all of those parts on one document, and you don't have to have my document. I actually have a portal that some of my crazy clients actually go into, enter the data, and it spits out a playbook. All right. So you put together this playbook. I prefer, and I always encourage people, even though they're in quadrant one and they think they need to put together their professional playbook first, I pause and I sigh. I say, can we please work on your personal one first?
Well, that's why they're in quadrant one.
That's why they're in
Quadrant one, yeah.
Right back to that profession.
Right. Let's go right to driving profits. We need more profits. And yes, we do. We always need more profits. So anyway, whether we're talking about a personal or professional, what I'm going to say now, so the equation looks like this. I create my playbook. And then what I do to my playbook then informs my calendar. You see, so we kind of skipped. We started talking about quadrant 2. How does quadrant 2 fit on a calendar? But do you just open up a calendar and start plopping in quadrant 2? I would say no. I would say instead, what I do is I work hard working on my life, my personal life, my professional life. And then what I do is those playbooks inform my calendar every Thursday evening. Every Thursday evening, they inform in detail the week that is to come, and less detail the week after that and the week after that. But as I get closer to that week that's coming, then it gets filled in. How does it do that? Well, it does it through three sources. Usually the goal steps, the habits, and the character development elements. Those are the three things. Once I review each of the playbooks, and then those three things get transferred onto my calendar. The playbooks inform my calendar. The world does not inform my calendar. My customers do not inform my calendar. My family does not inform my calendar. One of the things that I think that Stephen Covey was brilliant on is he talked about a principle-centered life. He talks about the difference between principles, values, and practices, that they're different. Principles are unchanging truths that God has placed in the fabric of our existence, that regardless of your religion, your paradigms, everybody knows about. And this is the life. So I know when I first read it, I thought, I bet you I'm family centered. And I thought that was a good thing. I found out, no, it's not a good thing, because principles are bigger than family. They're more important than family. They inform family. Principles inform business. Principles inform faith. Principles inform everything. And that's why for Christians who are familiar with your Bible, in Romans chapter 1, Paul teaches that basically, what we would call observations, that what we would call, the world, creation teaches us about God's existence. And from that, we extract the principles of life that are here. They've been here since the Garden of Eden, and they'll be here after I'm dead in the ground. These principles, reign. So when we lead from the outside in, there's nothing left, because the outside, godless, less informed reality consumes us and requires more and more and more, till we are dead and we have nothing. So instead, we pull from the principles of life. We filter that through our playbooks. We inform our calendar. And it's kind of like, you guys have seen that old analogy about putting the big rocks first, then the smaller rocks, then the gravel, then the sand, and the water, right? That's really the process. So that probably helps everybody, think through that. Then what I do is I cancel stuff. It happens every time. Because as I try to take an informed playbook, put it into the calendar. I go, oh, the world has gotten in there first. And sometimes it's not all bad. It's good stuff. But almost without fail, on Thursday night, I'm asking somebody if they could move this or that, or I'm saying, I'm sorry, I'm not going to do that. Now you get better at not having to do that because you learn that, gosh, that's uncomfortable. I don't want to do that again. I don't want to say yes and then later say no, because that's just not a good man.
Yeah, and I think what you're speaking to a little bit is we touched on it earlier, but the more you reconcile who you are, what your principles are, what your values are, the more clearly up front you'll be able to discern or decipher what you're going to agree to in the first place, versus having to backtrack and kind of say, I actually thought about that. I don't really want to be a part of that, thing. On the front end, you have more confidence and more clarity about what you're willing to agree to.
Yeah.
And, and then people have to respect that. If they don't, obviously that's a whole nother conversation, but
yeah. So it might be a silly question, but I think it's an important one because everything we're talking about is rooted in the principles. So if someone's never sat down and thought about these things, gone through this exercise, how do you come to your principles? Is it, I'm sure a lot of people have heard of like the 5 whys. You ask why 5 times. Is that a good way to go about it? Or
Yeah,
you've been doing this for a long time.
Yeah, I the 5 whys, 7 whys. I think that it even goes to like 13, 12 or 13. I mean, there's different philosophies on that. And the reason probably why the 7 or 12 or 13, whatever it isn't popular, because the 5 whys are hard enough. Right?
2 whys is hard.
And what Greyson is referring to is digging down deeper, right? Digging down, getting past the symptoms, getting past the, what seems to be obvious and going through that. Yeah. I don't want to necessarily promote stoicism, because stoicism in and of itself can become a religion, but there's certainly nothing wrong with thinking more and observing more and traveling more and learning from other cultures more. That's only helpful. I mean, think about the things that you've experienced in your life outside of your norm and how that adjusted your paradigm. I mean, Stephen Covey tells a story, right, in his book. I'll see if I can tell it real quick to get to Grayson's question. So he's on a bus. I think this is a true story he tells. He's on a bus or a train or something, airplane, something like that. And there's a man that has a couple of kids, and these kids are just like going cuckoo. They're just out of control kids. And Covey does a great job at kind of describing his much need for organization and neatness and no problems, right? And so while he's describing that this was irritating him and everybody else around it, and he was trying to be patient, at some point he said, he had to step in. So he carefully taps the gentleman on his shoulder and says, in a very polite way, says, I don't know if you've noticed, but your kids are basically acting like monkeys. He didn't say that, but and whatever that was. And when he said that, when he tapped the guy in the shoulder, it was almost like the guy was somewhere else in his head and came back. And so when he came back, he looked around, looked at the kids, and he goes, "Oh, it certainly looks that way. I'm so sorry. We just came from the hospital where these kids lost their mother and I lost my wife." And, Covey said, I was operating on a certain paradigm at that point of how life should work and look. And then all of a sudden, all the empathy in all of me, came over me. I think the answer isn't an academic one. I think the answer is, it goes back to a quadrant 2, because, we could say, we could literally go in my library and pull out a book of Stoicism and look at all the observations that would line up with your New Testament, also Proverbs. You won't see any contradictions there at all. Different language, different situations, different cultures. But deductive learning is never the best kind of learning, meaning someone gives you the answer. The best kind of learning is when you discover things, on your own or in a group, together. Winston and I do it a lot, and one of the funny stories we tell, and I don't remember what it was, but we were at Torchy's Tacos in Lincoln Heights, here in Texas, in San Antonio. and we were enjoying some chips and queso, and I haven't been exposed to it, so I was really enjoying that.
It's a good queso.
Yeah, good queso. I was drinking my Diet Coke, and I asked Winston a theological question, I think it was, and it was a hard one. And, and he acted like a true professor. He says to me, he looks me straight in the eye, dead eye, and he goes, "It's a necessary mystery." And I will never forget that answer for as long as I live. It was also a great way to dodge trying to come up with an answer. But there are many mysteries to the person who lives in ignorance, who doesn't chase after God, chase after the mysteries. And I think that's where a lot of things, are found. Like, for example, one of mine that I believe is a principle, and I've only been touting it now for probably 3 or 4 years, but it comes from loss. It comes from gain. It comes from the intersection of loss and gain. And that I used to say that pain is a synonym for love. And now I don't even believe that. I believe love and pain are two sides of the same coin. I don't really believe that you can love without also experiencing pain. And if you're experiencing pain, on the other side of pain, there is love. That would be an example of my own words that are also stated in some of these, philosophers, but in different ways.
Yeah, I think for me personally, to your question, something tangible or practical, even that I am learning and have learned, is just the importance of connecting to people that model principles well. And you could, some might call this mentorship, some might call this discipleship, but an intentional relationship with somebody further ahead of you, and you're learning from their life, and you're seeing what you can extract from their life that makes sense in your context, that almost supersedes context, and you're just seeing, man, this person is a person of integrity, and I want to literally model that. I see the effects of their life, and I want my life to align with that. But it's because of that principle that I'm seeing them live out in different ways. And so I just think being in proximity to and being intentional with mentors or people that you can walk alongside and learn from, ultimately, I think is a practical way to start evaluating, man, I can see that principle in their life. I want to start employing that in my life. So, kind of walking through this playbook idea, what are, I think we're about to jump into maybe just some character traits that are necessary as we're walking through this process.
Yeah, great. So the reason why I brought character into it is, again, because of what I've learned, right? Everything, I hope this episode doesn't sound like a know-it-all episode, because that's not what it is. Instead, it's more like a wrestling match. It's more like, surviving through the desert. It's being promoted to positions in my life at different times in my life that I was over my head. It was recognizing, not being able to recognize the insecurities that I already had in my own life, that I would say things that weren't exactly true or weren't right down the line, and then later say, why did I say that? Why did I do that? Why did I agree to something that I didn't really want to do? Why did I say a white lie there? Why did I not expose everything? Why could I not make a decision? Why did that wound me? Why did that hurt me? Why? That's where this is coming from. It's coming from, I was so guarded when I was younger. I had to be, whenever I made an error, in baseball or otherwise in life, I had self-hate. I mean, my bar for myself was working against me, because by nature, I'm an entrepreneur, I'm a risk taker, but I had these undeveloped weaknesses in me that were at war with those things. So I was a prisoner, feeling like I couldn't get out and be who I was. I mean, so to give you an example, when Phil Eastman, became an associate of mine in our work. He in his master thesis, him and I were talking. We were in Minnesota taking classes together, working towards a doctorate deal that I never finished and I know this is going to sound silly, but I finally had enough courage to ask myself, why am I doing this? And I couldn't come up with a reason why I wanted to do it. I knew my dad wanted me to be a doctor. He wanted me to have that. And that's awesome. And, he never pressured me, but they dropped stuff, drop hints and what have you. And my dad is still with us today. Great man. Love him to death. Hope he listens to this episode. But Phil asked me a question. He says, everybody uses the term character, but nobody defines it. And the best that we hear of is three things. Character is honesty and integrity. And then some wise guy came up with the idea it's character is what you do when no one's looking. And so who could argue with that, right? I mean, that sounds pretty good, but he went ahead and did a study on it. And his study was beautiful. He came back and he wrote a book, which I still have in my library, and it's out of print now. But I have to kind of guard it because it was a shaper for me. And what he found was that there are literally 7 elements of character. And 4 of those elements are centered around our temperament, which is interesting because Ezekiel chapter 1, one of the oldest books in the Bible, lists the 4 temperaments. They're listed right there. That's why I always encourage people to take the MBTI because it kind of mirrors, that. And I'm not saying that's the best temperament assessment. I'm not saying that. I'm saying it's a great foundational one, to start with. So from that, he came up with his research showed, I'm going to see if I can remember this: wisdom, justice, temperance, and courage. The New Testament, which to me is a very instructional book, not just for people of faith, but even people who doubt the story of Christ. It's an incredible book to read. There are so many wonderful things that you can extract from that. Well, the New Testament affirms those 4 and then adds a supernatural group that I believe all humans have, yet takes a unique relationship with God for them to blossom, which is faith, hope, and love. And so those are the 7 character elements. Now, what I do with that is once I put my playbook together, now people have taught me this. Everybody's taught me all this stuff, right? None of this is new with me. I just rearranged it, right? And came up with my own phrases and stuff that worked for me. Well, I was taught by David Cook that one of the best coaches in our nation, that goals should not be easy and they should not be impossible. Although a lot of people will tell you that you need to reach for the heavens because if you fail, you'll still, have your high elevation. He poo-poos that. And he also poo-poos setting easy goals. He said they should be difficult. Goals should be difficult, reachable, but difficult. And there's a lot of reasons for that we don't have time to go through in the episode. But when you apply logic to it, it makes sense because it tests your desire, it tests your skill, what have you. So when you put together your playbook, it should be difficult. So difficult means that there's probably an element of character that you need to grow in order to accomplish this playbook. And that's where I added in the character element. Can I identify what it is that's going to keep me from achieving this goal? And then that would become part of my plan to work on and to develop. Real quickly, let me share a couple other little practical things that kind of help everybody fill this in. So I think I said earlier, once the playbook informs my calendar, what that looks like is I've got blocks everywhere. And then of course there's plenty of room, for all the small rocks, to come in and they find their place. What I didn't touch on earlier is how it can transform your family, because my It is no longer my calendar. Now it is our calendar. And I don't have a calendar that's separate from my wife's calendar. It has become one calendar. So it's a dance, which makes the blocks even more difficult. Now, yes, some of them overlap. You know, she might be here doing this, I might be somewhere else doing that, but we have them both on there. So that's something that we learned really only the last 5 years. So that's kind of new, you know, for us, which is really cool. Let me tell you some other nuances that has shaped my calendar that won't be your case, probably because of age, where I'm at in life, where you're at in life, maybe where the listeners are at in life. More than 90% of all my appointments happen on Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday. I don't make appointments for Monday and Friday because of the self-awareness of who I am and what I need so that I can be on my game Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday. I don't do well when I'm trying to scatter all these different categories in one calendar. But that took me years to learn. So when I'm in coaching mode, I'm in coaching mode. And, you know, I'm like a horse with blinders on. I'm giving myself to these clients Tuesdays, Wednesdays, Thursdays. And it's that. My Mondays are for a certain thing, and my Fridays are for a certain thing, and my Saturdays. Do I use task lists? I don't, and I do. I don't in the traditional way of using task lists. But if you open up any of my Quadrant 2 blocks, you will find a list of tasks. And this is how I've learned to deal with my moods. So anything that survives in that block of time that I've written in tasks, I open it up, and now I'm in the mood to deal with those 2 tasks. I'm not in the mood to deal with that. Or now it doesn't matter whether I'm in the mood or not. This baby's screaming because it's a Quadrant 1, so I got to do it. And, you know, so that's kind of the realities of how I dealt with my own humanity, if that makes sense. I didn't feel like I closed that loop well enough on that.
That's really good. Yeah, if I can just speak to even just a practical thing that I am learning, and this comes from, you know, just the reality of being married this year, fall, 8 years married, 2 little ones, a 3.5-year-old and now a 1-month-old. And you know, pretty busy guy. And you know, there are often times where, you know, working with volunteers, working with their schedules, responding, being responsive to the needs of those that I'm leading and partnering with, found myself, you know, working after office hours, and my wife being an accountability partner, having the leadership to disrupt that cycle, if you will, if we're using the language that we've been using, and us having a conversation to figure out, okay, like what is a healthy way to, you know, still lead those that we're responsible for leading, but also, you know, make sure that you know, we're healthy at home and all things are in order. And so coming to this agreement that, okay, let's say Monday nights are, if anything is going to be scheduled after office hours, meetings or events or whatever, let's make that kind of the standard, that we just know that Monday nights are going to be after hours, potentially after hour meeting nights. And that way, more so for her, but both of us, now we have this expectation that is understood, versus previously maybe it kind of felt like on her end this came out of nowhere, or there was a misprioritization of, you know, my work versus, you know, my marriage or my family. And so us partnering together on the calendar
Great.
makes it way more tangible and digestible. And now we can look ahead and say, okay, you know, that specific Monday, we know what to expect. And also at the same time, you know, now we understand Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday feels differently because we've agreed on this Monday night thing. So just even that.
You know what else that does for you is once you start putting in the big rocks, right? And then you get a little bit stressed out because you go, well, gosh, that only leaves this much time to get all this done. No, what that means is you have all this time to get the most important stuff done. And so now you're having discriminating more and more. So the secret isn't about more and more, it's about what you throw overboard so that you will do the most important things. So that comment right there is drilling down to where this eventually gets you to. And to what you're saying, Winston, I want to make this clear for Grayson and yourself and the listeners, is that I want you to understand, set my personal constitution aside, because that covers my life holistically from a foundational base. But my professional playbook in no way tells you everything that I do. It only tells you what I'm going to do to accomplish this thing that I've listed. So it is very, very focused. Let me throw in another thing if I can, because you're on the calendar. If you go to my professional calendar, if you go down to the habits, you will see. I forget how it's stated. I don't know if you have it in front of you, guys, but I can pull it up if it doesn't. But it should say like one thing or
daily, one thing.
One thing. Okay,
Mhm.
let me tell you what that means. And that's the other thing. You can code your playbooks so that you don't have to worry about it getting in the hands of somebody else, because they don't even know what the heck it means. Because there are some things on the playbook that are very personal. If you go to my personal one, especially, but you won't know what it means because I've coded it. But I've learned that, right? I mean, it's a crazy invention, right? but shoot, I'm going to lose my train of thought. Oh, one thing. The game changer that I learned about 18 months ago, that I've only been practicing for a year and a half, and it has brought a whole nother level. I ask myself before I start the day, every day, if nothing else gets done, what is the one thing that's going to get done? And here's how I make that decision. I go into the future and I say, all right, let's say this doesn't get done, that doesn't get done. Oh my gosh, what a nightmare if that doesn't, but this does get done. How am I going to feel? And I could literally feel the relief. I could feel the sometimes excitement, sense of accomplishment. And that becomes my motivator to let nothing else distract me from getting that done. So will distractions happen? Yes. Will interruptions happen? Yes. But no matter what. And I also share those with my wife every single day. And she'll say, what's the one thing? This is the one thing. Okay. So you can have a bad day, you can have this interruption, but this day's not over until that thing is done. So that does sometimes bring in the midnight oil, but I've already counted the cost and I'm going to do it. But a lot of times it doesn't. It just says those other things have to be transferred over. And yes, now I got to adjust my calendar to reality, but I got that one thing done. And, I mean, how does it usually happen, you guys? The one thing doesn't get done, and that's just becomes another thing, and then another thing. And then you get freaked out, stressed out, and you're not a very good person.
Well, and usually that one thing you kick it to tomorrow, which tomorrow's not that far away.
Right.
Tomorrow's fine. But if you keep pushing it to tomorrow, next thing you know, it's been 3 months.
Right.
And now depending on how important it was, you're in a real pickle.
Yeah.
Right.
But yeah, no, that's good. The communication's key. I feel like that's a whole episode in and of itself. But by communicating, I know personally when I'm communicated to, or when I'm communicating to the people that's important to me, it prevents stories being made in their heads, which then has a whole other trickle effect down.
Mm-hmm.
And it ruins their day, and it ruins the dynamic of your relationship, and it sets a tone that you don't want in the house.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think what I find is that the gravity of comfort suffocates the potential for what we're talking about, which is disrupting rhythms in our life or in our household or our workplace that continually, once again, when I say gravity of comfort, it's comfortable to just accept the meeting that you don't need to be in. It's comfortable just to accept, this is the season of life in our home, or this is just where we're at in our health or in our finances. But to have the courage, to go back to the characteristic, to have the courage to disrupt that cycle and take the time to reconcile, okay, what needs to change?
Mm-hmm.
Like who do I need to be, or who do I want to be, and what does that need to look like on my calendar? What does that need to look like my personal constitution? But so many of us allow the gravity of comfort just to keep us in the same place, and we just keep in that quadrant one.
Yeah, that makes me think of you remember back in school, or if you're at some sort of seminar, they always say, no question's a stupid question, because someone else in here probably has the same question. So that makes me think too, everyone is comfortable, or most people, unless they're doing intentional strategic planning for their life like this, everyone's comfortable. And so there's probably other people that think that that meeting's pointless. There's other people, you know, your wife, your kids, they feel that we're heading down the wrong path. We're in a rut. But as a leader, we need to be the ones to make the change. And they probably won't even realize it till after you do it, after you say something, after you bring it to the surface, that they felt the same way. And they just needed that nudge to make the change that everyone felt, you know, under the surface.
Yeah, you know, there's a progression, right? And I think Covey teaches this too. And you know, before we close this episode, I think this is worth it if you guys are able to do this. But you know, I give you permission to look at the two playbooks I've given you, and does it spur any questions that you have, like what is this and how does that work or whatever. But let me say this: Covey teaches this to what you guys are just talking about. Since, you know, we picked on meetings as one example, right? In every progression of the most ultimate healthy place is interdependence, right? You're in that meeting because people think that, I mean, have you ever been not invited to a meeting and you're going, why wasn't I invited to a meeting? Right? Because so we're weird, right? So we get a little bit upset if we're not invited to a meeting. Now we're in a meeting. We're going, why am I in this meeting? Right. So let's own some of that too. Right. But we go from dependence. So we're very childlike in almost every process. You know, someone has to change our diapers, feed us. You know, you get the idea. Yeah, call that the onboarding process, maybe. And then you go to dependence. You're going, okay, I understand what I need to do to be effective. But to get to interdependence, meaning part of what you need to do is you also need others. And so that becomes an interesting, what's the word I'm looking for? Negotiation, communication about, you know, to be more effective, I need your help to consider this. Maybe this is when I should be brought into the meeting. You know, just using that as an example, but making sure that, you know, you're not portraying yourself as the butthead, but as somebody who understands as a member of the team, this is an important meeting. But you know, the 30 minutes of this or that, I could be doing this. And how can we communicate that I do believe this is an important meeting, but I also, you know what I mean? Mm-hmm. So we're trying to create that, right?
Same thing with our spouses.
Yeah, exactly. Because another, you know, definition of leadership is it's a dialogue, right? It's not directives. It's a dialogue.
It's good.
Right? And everything has seasons. So that meeting
yeah.
might have been a very critical meeting at one point in time in the organization. And now it's not quite as critical.
Right.
So reevaluating and then having that communication of, hey, let's just, you know, circle the wagons again. And do we need to keep doing this?
Yeah.
Yeah. I think the playbook dissection, if you will, warrants another podcast. I think we land the plane here. How would you want to land the plane here? Just kind of wrap this up.
I just happen to have a statement that I think would be good to land the plane. You ready for this? I had to write this down because I haven't memorized it yet, but I think it's worthy of memorization, almost like a Bible verse. Happiness, and you know, a lot of Christians poo-poo that word. I don't think they should. Although I understand why they do. I guess I shouldn't get distracted. Let me finish. Happiness is the fruit of desire and ability. This is complicated. Happiness is the fruit of desire and ability to sacrifice what we want now for what we want eventually. I'm going to read that again. Happiness is the fruit of desire and ability to sacrifice what we want now for what we want eventually. That's what a playbook is all about. That's what it's about. That's why you're getting your MBA. You're sacrificing money. You're sacrificing time. You're sacrificing time away from your spouse Tess because you're envisioning something else. If not only is it giving you language that is going to align you to clients who use that language. It's also giving you understanding of more complicated concepts. It's building a sense of confidence in yourself. It's also giving you credentials. It's giving you things that you desire, down the road, but you're having to sacrifice, for it now.
Mhm.
And that's essentially what a playbook is, whether it's relational, financial, whatever.
It's really good. I think that's just an incredible way to say we want to live on purpose.
Yeah.
We want to live on purpose. And yeah, looking forward to the next podcast. We'll maybe do a deep dive into some playbooks and maybe almost kind of like a Q&A and pick your brain.
That'd be good.
Jim, on the specific playbooks and get more granular in it. Well, thank you guys as always for joining us, and we'll see you next time on the Today Count Show.
Thank you for joining us here at the Today Count Show. Be sure to like and subscribe on whatever platform you listen or watch so you don't miss any content. And stay tuned for more coming soon.